Thank you very much for coming at this lunchtime. My name is Elika Burma, and I'm the director of TORCH, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. And as I'm sure many of you, if not all of you know, TORCH supports, facilitates, encourages interdisciplinary research and wider engagement with the humanities. And today's discussion is very much an example of that kind of wider engagement. The discussion is part of TORCH's Book at Lunchtime series, usually fortnightly, sometimes 3-weekly series of bite-sized book discussions across lunchtime, exploring new books in the humanities. And to tie in with our annual headline series, Humanities in the Digital Age, all of the books this term are exploring things digital. We have some really fantastic books lined up, and you should have a look out for our whole termly program, but we're particularly delighted today in discussing Meyer and Ralph Schroeder's wonderful book, covers up there on the screen, Knowledge Machines, Digital Transformations of the Sciences and Humanities. Ralph himself is unable to be here today, but we're really delighted to be joined by Eric, who is a senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. And the format, for those of you who've been here before, you'll know this very effective format we have is that each of the panelists will speak for about 5 to 8-ish minutes about the book, give responses to the book, after which Eric will reply, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience. The chair today is not actually me, but our wonderful Kathryn Eccles, who is the Digital Humanities Champion. It's a fantastic title and a big one to live up to. And she amply does so. And she is Research Fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. So, Kathryn, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Elika. So the format today is that we'll speak in this order, and I'll tell you who everybody on the panel is now, and then we'll let Eric respond to it. So starting next to Eric, we have James Smithies, who's recently joined our shores from New Zealand. He's the director of the King's Digital Lab at King's College London, and up until very recently was senior lecturer in digital humanities at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. He's worked in government, commercial IT sectors, as well as being a technical writer, editor, business analyst, and project manager. And he's currently writing a book for Palgrave Macmillan called The Digital Modern Humanities and New Media. So after James has spoken, we'll hear from Lucie Burgess, Associate Director for Digital Libraries at the Bodleian Libraries here in Oxford, also recently joined back in November, although it probably feels like much longer. 2014. Yes. And she joined us from the British Library, and she's responsible at the Bodleian for leadership of Bodleian's digital library systems and services and the digital initiatives in the library, which are considerable. It's a huge portfolio. Lucie is part of the senior exec team at the library, led by Bodleian's librarian, and she has a master's degree in physics from Hertford College, Oxford. So she's going to be talking from a very interesting set of angles, I think. And then I will speak, and you've heard enough about me. So I'm going to invite James to come and take the floor now. Thank you.
Well, many thanks for inviting me today. Eric was kind enough to provide me with a proof of knowledge machines when he was visiting us in New Zealand a couple of years ago.
Yeah, about 2 years ago.
Yeah, and it's actually had a significant impact on my own monograph as I've been writing it over the last 2 years. I'd like to make 2 preliminary remarks, one general and one specific. Firstly, I think knowledge machines is important for the social sciences and humanities, but in different ways. For the social sciences, it's an important exploration of digital technologies and their impact on research. The book's focus on networked, internet-based technologies is an extremely useful addition to the existing literature. That particular critical lens and technological lens is crucial to the book. The exploration of internet-based research in its social, methodological, but also infrastructural aspects provides us with important critical leverage. And I think that's where Eric's thinking chimes with mine. I like to look at the digital world from an engineering, technology-heavy perspective. For the humanities, though, I think it provides a model that humanists need to do more with. I don't think we look at the big infrastructural perspective enough. I don't think we've been critical enough about the larger infrastructural and methodological questions that digital humanities and social sciences, but digital humanities work implies. So knowledge machines bridges the divide between digital social science and the humanities, the digital humanities. And it reminds humanists that we need to think about the larger context of our work rather than the micro, rather than having a micro focus. And so that speaks to the book's contribution to humanities and social science research. It provides an important critical frame for thinking about digital research technology as well as using it. And it's that critical frame, that methodological frame, that's needed at this stage in the development of humanities and social science research as we start to deploy these emergent technologies. And secondly, in a related sense, knowledge machines is a contribution to the problem of software-intensive science. And I'd like to broaden that notion out into software-intensive humanities. We've been aware of the issues associated with software-intensive science for some time. We haven't been thinking enough about the implications of software-intensive humanities research. So as Eric and Ralph write, quote, as software applications become more and more complex, the ability of individuals to understand the entire workings of the application implementing the algorithms diminishes, particularly for those who did not participate in the creation of the algorithms and their implementations in software, end quote. So this has important implications for digital research, widening the gap between researchers and the object of their inquiry. And it calls into question the nature of knowledge produced using software-intensive methods. Interestingly though, knowledge machines expands the discussion from this granular level of algorithms and code, which is problematic enough, and asks us to consider the epistemic implications of digital research infrastructures as well. When we place those two issues side by side, the large and the small, and add a human researcher to them, what's more, the true complexity of software-intensive research becomes apparent. As someone tasked with setting up a digital humanities laboratory, these issues, the soup of issues, are of special interest to me. We know what a scientific laboratory looks like. What does a humanities laboratory look like? What practical and epistemic issues does software-intensive research bring to the humanities and social sciences? And how do we manage the complex relationships between large and small aspects of digital research infrastructures and develop projects in a sustainable and intellectually transparent way?
Okay, so the central tenet of this book is that there has been a transformation in how knowledge is produced, creating these online knowledge machines that underpin the advance of research. And essentially it's a reflection on the way that new technologies have reconfigured the way that knowledge is generated. But it's also then contributed to further transformational changes in technology, like a kind of accelerant or enzyme. So we're talking about a virtuous circle of relationships here. So I'd just like to talk about some of the surprises and reflections and kind of wow moments that I had when I read this book, and then throw out some provocations and challenges for Eric to respond to, and perhaps for the audience here to participate in too. So in terms of kind of wow moments and surprises, firstly, it was obviously wonderful to see the Bodleian's EBO text creation partnership referenced in the book as a knowledge machine, something which is digitized and encoded, all English books printed from around 1440, the very earliest days of printing, to 1700, and, you know, which would have cost many, many, many millions of pounds if we had tried to do that, you know, through direct investment. And the promise of that's just being realised because the first 40,000 pages of transcriptions going into the public domain. So very nice to see that. Some wonderful case studies, I think, in the book. There's a very interesting case study of the Centre for Embedded Network Sensing, where participants from different domains view data differently. So, for example, we've got engineers on sensor projects interested in performance data, scientists interested in scientific data like water temperature or acidity, and data analysts on contextual data like calibration values. And the point of that is that data libraries need to try and accommodate the needs of different researchers across the full data lifecycle. And that's a kind of fundamental theme, I think, that runs through the book. And as somebody who works a lot on data curation and thinking about data, it was really nice to see that reflected. There's a very interesting case study on a collaboration called Swiss Biogrid, which was a partnership between research institutes and industry in Switzerland, which drove new discoveries, partly because the in silico investigations being delivered by the research institute could then be tested in the lab and in the wild on real samples. So I thought that was a really nice collaboration between the digital and the physical, if you will, and that's something I'll return to in my challenges. And then there's the Pynchon Wiki, which I'd never heard of, but I was just absolutely fascinated by. And I had a look online at the wiki and, the annotations made by individuals as part of this social network to try and understand his arcane language and, reference to thousands of characters and events, real and imagined. So I thought that was very, very interesting. An interesting aside about grey literature and the fact that, the things that we see on Scopus and Web of Science, which we rely on to do our research, are really just the tip of the iceberg. And that there are huge numbers of sources out there. I mean, all librarians know this, and I'm sure most researchers do too, but, particularly in grey literature, in conference proceedings and theses and so on, that are very, very difficult to find and analyse digitally at any kind of scale. And an interesting discussion around open source collaboration and the extent to which open source software can produce viable tools for research, for e-research in particular. So there's this conundrum that, open licenses foster open innovation and they can lead to commercial reuse. And a cynic might say, of course, that then we'll have software companies selling our software back to us as researchers. So I think something around the attention economy and the fact that only those tools that can be sustained for long enough will generate the investment back to make them viable. And along that lines was a really interesting example of a company called GeoView, which created Virtual London, a tool that was a kind of 3D map of London and for data to be overlaid on that mapping provided by Ordnance Survey, which sadly was shelved, partly because Ordnance Survey refused to give this company a license. But it did give birth to the Guardian's Free Our Data campaign, so there was something happy born out of that rather sad situation. So my challenges, I have three kind of challenges and things that I think are further areas for research. And the first of these is that the first chapter provides a slightly tantalising suggestion that the idea of the internet includes, I quote, not only the underlying network devices and connections, but also the devices, sensors, applications, databases, network tools, data and content residing on these technologies. And of course, that leads us to the Internet of Things, this concept of machine-to-machine communications, which promises to deliver somewhere in the region of 30 to 50 billion networked devices by 2030, depending on which report you read, with humans both in and out of the loop. And, this Internet of Things will give us everything from autonomous vehicles and smart cities, smart household devices like the ubiquitous smart fridge, to digitally executable contracts using blockchain technology and the ability to spend fraud-proof digital currencies. So, and anybody here who's wearing a Nike Fitbit is already participating in that second digital revolution. So my challenge is, given that this book is not about consumer devices, it's about research infrastructures, is what role do we think the Internet of Things is going to play in that next generation of e-research? Now that we're thinking more about fog computing than cloud computing, where is that going to take us, particularly in the arts and humanities and the social sciences? Okay, and my second challenge, I think, is around innovation, collaboration, and risk. So there's a very interesting case study in the book around the Splash project, which was a project to do photo identification of humpback whales. And this project took place at a time when digital and analog photography technology were really flipping over. So you had lots of different scientists all over the world trying to reliably identify and count global whale populations, and they were using many different standards of photography and digital files. And this is an issue we see. It's a live issue today, even though it's a case study from I guess 10 years ago. Something we're doing at the Bodleian with many cultural institutions is something called IIIF, the International Image Interoperability Framework. And my challenge is, what more can we do to kind of foster these risky interdisciplinary collaborations where you can take a technology which has been applied in one discipline and then apply it equally successfully, but perhaps in a slightly different way in another? Those things are risky and difficult to fund. And then thirdly, I have to talk about data curation and reuse, because it's something that's very close to my heart. Towards the end of the book, there is a paragraph that says, smaller e-science, e-social science and digital humanities projects face issues of scale as they attempt to share data more widely and contribute to larger data sets. And then it goes on to say, legacy data or data developed prior to the shift of a new technology can cause significant problems during efforts to standardise and federate data sets. And that's a really key problem for the humanities. And I think it's partly a problem because of this issue around, it's an unresolved issue around academic researchers can be assigned credit and rewards for the use of their data and creation of their data. Something that a colleague at Newcastle University has termed data trajectories. So how can we map those trajectories and make sure that people get credit for the data that they create and release onto the open web? Thank you.
I guess I'm in a slightly unusual position with this book in that it slightly maps out my journey as a researcher and my transformation from historian to social scientist, digital humanist. I sit on the fence really and look to both sides. So I joined the Oxford Internet Institute back in 2008 as a relatively newly minted history DPhil. And I joined to work with Eric, who's been a fabulous colleague, and much of the work that is in this book has been just a joy to be part of with Eric and Ralph. And at the time, back in 2008-09, we were doing the first understandings really of what was happening in the humanities, what the transformation of archives to digital archives was doing to scholarly behaviour, to scholarly communication. And we were interested in whether this was opening up new questions, whether it was really transforming scholarship or just making it faster and more efficient. Questions that I think we're still wrestling with a little bit today. So back in 2008, when much of the work in this book was getting underway, there was a much clearer sense, I think, that e-research was this very new and very innovative and experimental field, that all these projects were really separated from the normal scholarly behaviour that we were used to seeing. And it really struck me coming back to this book how much that landscape has shifted in the ensuing years. And I think most of the scholars in this room would say that their working lives are can't fail to be transformed by digital. There's digital in everything that we do now. So I think that it was very interesting just to think back how far we've come in terms of studying the transformations and really being transformed ourselves as scholars. It made me feel a bit maudlin about the fact that Bill Dutton isn't here anymore, because our founding director, Professor Bill Dutton, founding director of the OII, was really, I think, at the heart of much of the research in this book. And he provided the environment that allowed it to take place in one building and with a particular set of scholars. And it really struck me just how ahead of the curve he was actually in setting much of this in motion. He had two very large linked ESRC grants that enabled many scholars from different disciplines to come together, and talented doctoral students, thanks to his building the OII into the shape that it currently is in. We were able to take doctoral students and early career scholars whose work was really fundamental to the growth of the Institute and its setting out its territory and to the research presented in this book. So I think his influence on all this work is considerable, and I wanted to just remember that today. So he enabled us to sort of be co-located with all these very different, vibrant influences. And I think that's what we want to do with this Torch series, is to bring humanities to the fore in all of those exciting debates. So, having been a bit maudlin, now I'll get on to the real business, which is talking about the things that struck me about the book and where I think, like Lucie, there's room for a bit of debate and some future research. Starting with disciplinary differences. So Eric and Ralph draw out brilliantly, I think, how all this data on how enthusiastically the arts and humanities have taken up digital methods, tools, and materials and have really incorporated those into their scholarly pursuits. It's brilliant to hear that. I think there's really an impression that the arts and humanities lag behind the sciences and the social sciences in that respect. It's quite an entrenched view, and it's very comforting to see that narrative disrupted in the book and with great data to back it up. I wondered if there had been any surprising reactions to that from people who've engaged with the book, and whether that's something that you'd expected. Andrew Prescott, who's Professor of Digital Humanities at Glasgow and the AHRC theme leader for digital transformations in the arts and humanities, did a lovely review of the book and made the point that although it would be an exaggeration to say that the arts and humanities are more digital than other disciplines, and there may be STEM work on technologies that will enable the future landscape for digital scholarship in arts and humanities, there does seem to be a stronger engagement with digital methods for communicating research in the arts and humanities than elsewhere. And that made me think about REF and impact, the impact framework, our knowledge exchange initiatives. And I wondered if there is something to say here about whether we are going to see a separation of disciplines in terms of the way that they are engaging in and then being measured on those kinds of knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange relationships. So are we provoking more difference through these knowledge machines? And how will we cope with that in a very formal structure of reward? Something else that struck me about the book was the extent to which these knowledge machines were providing shared platforms and methods across different disciplines. So we're taken from aggregating many eyes for science to aggregating many minds for humanities. Are these shared methods and shared strategies always positive? In my experience, these shared insights and shared explorations have been very valuable. And I think the OII, the reason I love it so much is because it really fosters that kind of interdisciplinary environment. But I'm not naive, and I don't think that will be the case for everyone. So I wondered if Eric might talk about some areas of tension between the disciplines in sharing the same platforms and methods and data sets. Just two more things to talk about. One is about forgetting, which we heard about in our opening panel for Humanities in the Digital Age. And I thought a really striking but short section in the book was about web archives and digital dust. And that strikes me as a really important matter for the future. So the knowledge machines that Eric and Ralph discuss in the book are deft and dynamic, but the archived knowledge machines of the past are much less so. And this is a really major problem for future scholars. So the assumption that the knowledge machines that we know and use today, that they'll be available in the same way in perpetuity, needs to be really radically and rapidly corrected. The richness of these machines, these contemporary machines, is not being sufficiently captured. and preserved, and scholars seeking to do the kind of deep research presented in this book in decades to come will find a major source of data and understanding absent or only available in a very restricted way. So I wanted to ask Eric to talk a little bit more about that problem, the impact of that problem, and Lucie, actually. I wondered if both of you could talk about the challenges of archiving and preserving that material for the future. So my last point is about research parasites. I was really pleased to see Eric and Ralph drawing attention to the difficulties of incorporating data sharing into our systems of academic reward and esteem, and to hear Lucie mention it too. I think it's a really pertinent issue, because we're being increasingly asked to share our data, to provide open access to it. But there are clearly professional and ethical issues surrounding those practices. I don't know if anyone saw this recent debate on Twitter about research parasites, following an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, arguably the top medical journal in the world, suggesting that it was a concern that, and I'm quoting, "a new class of research person will emerge, people who had nothing to do with the design and execution of the study, but use another group's data for their own ends, possibly stealing from the research productivity planned by the data gatherer, or even to use that data to try to disprove what the original investigators had posited. There is a concern, they suggest, among frontline researchers that the system will be taken over by what some researchers have characterised as research parasites. Sharing data should come with no strings," Twitter has alerted the editors of this piece to, and I totally agree. But I think this opens up two really interesting questions. One is about the extent to which these new scholarly practices and the new knowledge machines at the heart of this book can shake up and really panic established orthodoxies. And the second is about the fact that the knowledge machines create public spaces for debate about these scholarly practices, which is really refreshing and I find incredibly helpful, but clearly others may not. And I'd be interested in the thoughts of everyone on the panel. So now I'm going to hand over to my fantastic colleague, Professor Eric Meyer, to answer some of our questions.
So thank you for coming, and thank you to the three of you for reading the book and for having such interesting comments about it. So I'm not supposed to talk very long, but I wanted to just say a couple of things that occurred to me in listening to them, and I'll try to touch on some of their questions, but then we might visit those back. Whoops, kill myself up here. So first of all, apologies on behalf of my close collaborator, Ralph Schroeder, who's off sunning himself on a beach in Southern California someplace. One of the things, for those of you who know us, and some of the people here in the room know the two of us, this book was a series of hard-fought battles between the two of us. We're the closest of friends, but we're also the biggest of each other's critics. And so everything has been exposed to fights back and forth between claims that I would make and Ralph didn't believe, and claims he would make and I didn't believe. So even the title of the book involves so many fights to get to this title that we were happy with, of knowledge machines. So this is not something that we just sort of thought up and did this seemed like a cute thing at the time. We had a list of titles. I would come up with ones and Ralph hated them all. He would come up with ones and I hated them all. We'd send them all to the publishers. They would hate everything. Eventually we came up with this thing that we really thought encapsulated what we were trying to say, is that the internet and the other technologies, as Lucie pointed out, that are attached to us, are forming these combined machines of things that include people, technologies, and other sorts of things. It's a very STS point of view that there are people and technologies working together. We can leave aside the question of agency and things like that, but regardless of that, there are these machines of people and technologies working together to generate new kinds of knowledge. I should also briefly mention, for those of you who don't know me, a little bit about the backgrounds of the two of us, because I think it helps explain a little bit about the book. So my background is something called social informatics. I got a degree in information science, but social informatics, the way I always describe it to people, is if you've got the word socio-technical and you spell it with a hyphen in the middle, I examine the hyphen. So how people and technologies are connected to one another. And I've written an article called Examining the Hyphen, if you want to read it, that talks about these connections between people and their technologies. So in that way, I try to go into things not privileging either the socio or the technical when I'm trying to understand new configurations of things like knowledge machines, but understanding that in any given, some of our case studies here, the technology might emerge as slightly more important, or the people's choices might emerge as slightly more important, but these things are always in dialogue with each other. Now, Ralph comes from a different background. He's a sociologist by training. He comes from a background in sociological theory. His thesis many years ago was on Weber. And so one of the things that we've brought to the table as collaborators, I think, is that I am the first to admit that Ralph is much stronger on theory and highfalutin ideas floating in the clouds than I am. And I rely on him very heavily for that. And that he will tell you equally that I'm the one who's grounded in data and be able to pick apart the kinds of claims that he's making and see whether they can be supported empirically. And I hope that comes through in the book, that there are these ideas that are floating around, and you know, we both contributed to both, but I think the dialogue back and forth between us was what helped the book do that. Also, as Kathryn pointed out, you know, this does owe a lot to both Bill Dutton, but also the whole e-science era and the e-social science era in the UK. Some of you may have been involved in that and aware of it, but if you weren't, it was a really intense period of time in the first decade of the 21st century here in the UK, when there was lots of funding, there was lots of activity, there were loads of meetings about e-social science and e-sciences in the UK, and we were all very much a part of that, and that fed into what we were able to do in the book. So, you know, if I had loads of time, I could have brought 100 slides and told you all about all these case studies and very exciting things that I still love talking about, but I won't do that because we don't have the time for that. Instead, let me just refer very briefly to some of the challenges that were made by the speakers. So one was this idea that Lucie brought up about how technology from one discipline can move to others, and I think Kathryn mentioned that a bit as well. If Ralph were here, he would say, I think that he's got a term that, what's it called? When he talks about it, he likes to think of technologies as sort of passports between disciplines, that technologies, more generalizable technologies, can move tools and techniques from one discipline to another. That doesn't mean that they move completely unchanged. It doesn't mean that humanities scholars have to simply take what physicists have used and either use them or fail to use them. This was the argument in some of the very early e-science, the naive things that was that physicists have built things like the Large Hadron Collider. They know how to do lots of shiny stuff. Everyone else should start behaving like physicists. So if you look at the early period of the e-social science program in the UK, it was all about the grid. And social scientists were going to start using the grid. And humanities people were going to start using the grid. Well, it turns out most of us didn't have much use for the grid. Grid is appropriate for certain kinds of large computational shared approaches. But it didn't really make much sense when you're dealing with stuff that can be dealt with perfectly well on your laptop and doesn't need grid-enabled computing. So people learned early on that it wasn't just a case of taking what physicists learned about the grid and applying it to other disciplines. So I think we've learned a lot over the last 15 years that the technologies can transfer, and we can start to use things like, whether it's public things like Twitter and the data that's out on the web, or specific research technologies like machine learning, and adopt those into different disciplinary specificities, but by engaging people with the technical expertise and the domain expertise. There are a slew of examples of failures that I think comes up to this question that Kathryn raised about areas of tension between disciplines, when one discipline just views their collaborators from another discipline as in service to them. You know, if you bring in some computer scientists and say, I need you just to do this work for me and then be quiet about it, that's probably not going to work very well because they're going to be put upon and they're not going to be getting anything out of it. Likewise, if you're a bunch of computer scientists and you say, oh, we built really cool tools, give us some data and we'll figure out things about it. We don't really need your involvement in understanding it. I can give you plenty of examples of that happening as well. It doesn't work really well. The really successful collaborations are ones that can find things that both can do and both can get new things out of it. You know, can advance computer science and algorithms and other kinds of approaches, but also will advance the knowledge. So I think that's really a challenge for anybody in this space, is to come up with ways that let the different partners actually get something out of it and not just be service to the people who are involved on the other side. A very sort of visceral example of this is from the arts sector. I was doing a project with a theater in London, and they were working with a technology development firm to build a tool that would let artists collaborate in the design of new theater projects. And the theater had designed a remit for the project that I thought was quite clear. They thought were quite clear, but the technology firm had done something different. They built something that did other kinds of things. And at the meeting, when they were talking about the implementation of this, the theater people kept saying, but it doesn't work. It doesn't do what we wanted it to do. And it doesn't, we're not going to use this because it doesn't help us collaborate. It doesn't help us be what we want to be as artists. And the technology firm stood firm and they said, It works perfectly. There's no bugs in it. There's no errors. It works perfectly. And they just could not get on the same page of one saying it works perfectly and the other one saying, but it doesn't work at all. And eventually it was a very acrimonious split between the two. And I can tell you the moment that split was absolutely certain was when the technology side said to the artists, you just don't understand how much more valuable our time is than yours. And that was the end was nigh once that came out of their mouths. But I think this is something we need to make sure doesn't happen, that one side views their contributions as inherently more valuable than the other side simply because maybe they cost more in their daily rates, but also because they're bringing different things or they don't properly value the kinds that their partners are bringing to it. So then just one last thing. I haven't answered all the challenges, but you can come back to those in your questions if you like. This question about stealing and research parasites. So this is a persistent fear, right? That somebody's going to steal my stuff and they're going to get credit for this. We had a really lovely doctoral student a number of years ago named Lucie Power, who's now a consultant with a company called ThoughtWorks in Australia. And I gave her a task once. We were working on some projects. She was working on shared scientific collaboration in her thesis. And we kept coming up with this complaint that, oh, people are going to steal my data if they get access to my data. And we said, go find me concrete examples of how often this happens. And let me tell you, there's rare as hen's teeth. The number of times, there are some examples of people sort of scooping other people based on their data, but it's really rare. It's mostly based on people's fears of this happening rather than people being able to point to actual examples of being scooped on their own data. So I think we need to be a bit realist about this in terms of, as Lucie mentioned, building up systems of credit and reward so that if you use somebody else's data, you can give them proper credit and reward and that they will then accumulate sort of academic points for having people use their data. But we need to somehow get past this fear that I've collected all this valuable data, don't anybody look at it, it's mine, this is my career at it. Data is no longer necessarily this rare commodity that you can spend your life just gathering a tiny little bit of data that only you understand and you don't want anybody else to look at except you give them little peeks at what your answers were. Instead, we need to start thinking about how we can make everybody's research advance more by sharing data and by sharing the kinds of tools that we have available to us. So that's just a couple of things you brought up, but hopefully you guys enjoyed reading the book. You've all read it more recently than I have, so if there's questions, maybe you'd be better at answering than I would. And thank you for coming today, and I'd be happy to address any of the questions, and I'm sure the panel would as well. Thanks.